Hi, everyone. We're here talking to Danielle Geathers, who is the first Black female president of the student body at MIT in its 159-year history, which is an amazing, amazing accomplishment. We're so excited to be talking to you, and thank you so much for finding the time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Awesome. I'm just going to get going here. We have a few questions for you, but would love to hear your thoughts on a whole bunch of different topics. So for me, I hear this a lot in feminism and a lot with women, that you can't be what you can't see. And I think you sort of breaking this historical chain of this position always being held by somebody who is probably in the majority or the like, is really creating an image for people out there that they can see something different and different for themselves. Was that important to you? Was that part of the process for you in deciding to run for student body president of MIT?
Yes, definitely. I think it's funny. I think about what I'll hopefully show other people, but I think even thinking about why I was hesitant to run, in what I thought a president was and what I envisioned a president looking like, I think that even affected kind of my journey and almost what held me back from getting to this role. So I think even further, just the idea of having a Black woman go to MIT, I think is radical enough. So I'm really excited to hopefully increase Black women matriculation to MIT in general, and then take the step further and make our student government way more inclusive.
Yeah.
All right. So being that I'm a father of two amazing brown daughters, 14 and 10, it's always super apparent that I have to provide tons of role models and plenty of people and guidance and structure to give them the vision board of what leadership and what a strong woman looks like, and particularly what a strong Black woman looks like. In the past, can you share with us who have been your role models that you might have looked up to?
Yeah, so I was very blessed to have a strong woman mother. She's actually a lawyer, so I grew up going to the courthouse with her. She was part of a Black Women's Bar Association, so I really do think, looking back, I was just constantly surrounded by Black women who were proud of their academic achievements and willing to be really strong powerhouses in a realm where they were underrepresented. So I think I was really blessed. I had my mother, I had my grandmother, who was also a firehouse on both sides, actually. And I think just in general, the typical people, Michelle Obama has always been amazing. I think I saw Angela Davis on the Black Power mixtape for the first time in high school, and I was like, oh my gosh. So there's definitely a lot of people along the way.
That's awesome. So you kind of already touched on it. So I am your fellow nerd, so I say this affectionately, right? But I bet that people, you kind of touched on it, don't expect you to be a math and science person. Don't expect you necessarily to have the facilities to be able to compute and process math, science, and other things like engineering at the level at which you do, which is obviously exceptional and best in the world and best in class. How do you handle that? And then I think there are opportunities for maybe people like us to use that sort of unexpected expectation in your favor, right? They are already discounting you prior to you speaking or walking into a room. You could possibly use that to your advantage. So sort of how do you navigate a world where people don't expect you to be the person that you actually are once you start speaking or talking on a topic?
Yeah, I think honestly the biggest threat of that is people constantly discounting you and almost saying, oh, why would you run for president? Why would you apply to MIT? And I think that's what holds people up, and that's the bottleneck most of the time, kind of those oh, those no's you get, or those, why would you do that? So I think my advice for those cases is to really just have a goal you think you can accomplish and set forth on that, and don't let anyone stop you, because I think if I let anybody's low expectations for me stop me, I would not be at MIT, or kind of who knows what school I would attend. So I think it's very important to understand yourself better. I think a lot of people are oh, college counselors, they're an expert, or this person, they're an expert. But I think nobody knows you better than yourself. So really the idea of setting expectations to yourself and not letting anyone lower those. In terms of the advantages, I do think it is very helpful. And I think that I'm also not really considered a STEMmy person, just because I'm so into the humanities as well. But I think that rather than letting that set me back, or thinking, oh, should I be at MIT? I'm not obsessed with physics. I think it's really important to just understand that any aspect of your personality is an advantage. Potentially some people see it as a disadvantage, but it can just help you. So I think specifically for me, I think in those times when people discount my STEM ability, I think I'm able to, even if I keep that in my back pocket, and just use like my leadership skills, my communication skills to kind of exceed expectations and kind of get the job done that way.
Awesome. Love that sort of well-rounded skill set. I think some people, I've heard the term a geek who speaks affectionately, and it's definitely you, right? Somebody that has the STEM skills and the math and science background, but also can use your humanities background, your charm, your charisma, et cetera, to sort of navigate these situations. It's great. So, you know, in reading about your story and becoming the president of the student body, you did it under really interesting and uncertain times, in that you had to throw your hat in the ring and campaign during a COVID era where all students were sent back to their respective homes and no one was on campus. And so, as I understand it, and we'd love for you to expand upon it more here, it was basically a full social media campaign, and you were social first in getting people to vote for you, and you won by a slim margin. So we'd love to hear the story. But you know, also us at the King's Run, we're also social first, right? We also realize the power of these platforms. And so any nuggets that you can share with the audience too around how you use social to make change, because ultimately we're all trying to do the same thing. So we'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, it's funny. I was like thinking about the mishaps I found on social media. But yeah, I think our whole campaign had to be a social media campaign. But we did a lot of also Zooming. So I was on Zoom, I think 12 hours a day, and that was really important. But I think just in terms of like connecting with people, it's so important that your social media is authentic. I think it's very easy to like Photoshop pictures of us in suits, like standing back to back, like that's not what people want to see for the most part. Like, we're college students. They want to see us be college students, just ones that are like updated on information and care about them. So I think from our campaign's perspective, it was really honestly built on our values, which were unity, authenticity, and equity. So one other, like our biggest like tidbit, I guess I could say, was that we had our friends like made art for us, and then we would just include it. So like anytime somebody photoshopped a picture of us, sent us a picture, we'd be like, oh, look at this art made by this person. And then everyone also reblogged it and shared it. So I think the idea of also like shared social media handles in which you're promoting other people's work as well as like promoting your own message is really helpful and really powerful, specifically in like this now Instagram age where you can like post to your story somebody else's story and like using that to garner even more media. So I think a lot of people think of like, if I post something, who will see it? But I think it's really important to think about who will repost what you post. And that's so much more important. Mm-hmm. That's my opinion.
And how many votes did you win by? I know the answer, but you got to tell everyone.
Oh my gosh. I knew that number so well. 28?
I think it's 28. So you, I mean, really, like, kudos to your efforts, because you had to beat the drum every day, as we talk about all the time, to get people out there, you know, to what has about 4,800 or 5,000 undergrads, right? So amongst a lot of other people by a small margin, but that's an amazing, amazing story.
Yeah, that's amazing. I don't know if I would have had the due diligence to maintain that, but that says a lot to your prowess, and it speaks volumes to who you are as a woman. So we share some commonalities. So I've been informed that you went to predominantly all-white high school. So I'm gonna rewind. About 20 plus years ago, I was in high school. No, even longer than that.
I didn't want to say anything.
I went to a prep school in Connecticut. Had some very interesting experiences, right, where I was the only Black kid from Brooklyn. So, you know, and you can imagine that backdrop of being dropped into the YOLO, the Polo Yacht Club, in that entire scene. And, you know, and I faced a lot of trials and tribulations of like overt and inovert racism, you know, and it taught me a lot to actually how to navigate through that space. But I'm realizing, and I'm hearing through listening to hip hop music, listening to a lot of your contemporaries, how are millennials and Gen Zs actually interacting with this racism narrative? Because when I was your age, it was a lot more overt, a lot more in your face, and less apprehensive to have the conversation. But now it seems to be more constructive conversation. But are you still encompassing that level of racism?
Yeah, so I think my school was a very like interesting example or like case study in terms of it. I think although like nobody at my school would like admit to being racist or say anything from that perspective, I think it's more about like the adaptation of Black culture with like the unwillingness to actually learn about the like suffering of Black people like over the centuries. So I think it's typically more like an ignorance thing, I think, rather than overt racism. But I think in terms of Black students in this space, it's a very similar experience. I would say that everyday othering is kind of what we feel, or the very, like, I think in my high school specifically, like the N word was used all the time by everybody, just in terms of like, not even with rap songs, like, they just thought it was fine. They said A at the end is different than ER at the end. Who are you to tell me what I can say? And so I think that had a big effect on a lot of Black students who attended my school. And then also, like, there was, like, people just weren't educated just in terms of, like, not understanding that jungle fever had a racist, like, tinge to it. People thought, oh, why is that racist? I don't even understand. Or, like, just little things like that, I think, are the main thing. So I think one thing a lot of Black students, specifically in predominantly white environments, have a problem with is the idea of, oh, this white person's my friend and we hang out and it's cool. But then sometimes they have this really messed up belief and they don't hear me when I tell them that this is wrong. So kind of balancing that like ever present now cancel culture with trying to reform people, but then you lose energy when you spend so much time constantly explaining yourself. So I think that's a really big tug. And one thing I actually did see when the George Floyd and national conversations about race came up was the idea of people like on Instagram seeing that trauma, but then also seeing some of their friends ignoring that trauma, which was just a double blow. And so one of like the biggest mental health things I've seen from that like side is like people really falling into this deep depression because of one, what stuff is happening, and then two, people they're calling their friend just completely ignoring it. So I think those are some of the nuances affecting our generation because of social media.
Brilliant, brilliant. And I want to piggyback on that. That even carries into our generation of contemporaries, you know, to mirror people who you thought were steadfast, your allies and friends, to go mute. And at your age group, it's almost accepted to go mute about not having a voice or opinion, right? But when you get to my age group, you're completely aware of what's going on. You're well-traveled, you're educated, you understand the dynamics of social economic, what's going on in the world. So you being intentionally mute hurt. It's like, and I've even, after we had this conversation about my levels of anxiety and probably some depression of people who I held in such adoration being intentionally silent, you know?
Yeah, especially I work now, so kind of that corporate America, a lot of like Black people coming into the workplace days after all these events and people just being like, so did you get your project done? That was kind of a nuanced thing for me, that idea of like working while Black and going into an environment where your coworkers and people you like really respect are just ignoring everything.
It's really interesting. Yeah, thank you. So as part of your studies at MIT, you did an independent study that I read about around the history of Black female recruitment at MIT. And so I'd love to hear, I'm sure there were some really interesting, maybe even surprising things that you found out throughout that process. Would love to hear what those are. And then just in general, if you zoom out, like, it's like for all of us to know, how do big institutions approach recruitment, diversity, making sure they have the right mix of people? It even applies to your point about corporate America and your job now. I mean, I'm sure you've uncovered some findings in that process that'd be really interesting for us all to hear about.
Yeah, so I think MIT actually has such an interesting story from that perspective. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Shirley Jackson, who's now the president of Rensselaer, but she created the Black Student Union at our school, and they actually adopted a shared governance leader with the admissions director at the time. So they went from having 7 Black students one year to having 53, like literally an explosion, a crazy amount of increase. And how they did it was they actually incorporated Black students into the recruiting process. So what they did was on holidays, they encouraged Black students when they went home to have these MIT admissions events for people in their community. And they did like these really cool things, like they bought ads in like Ebony and Jet. Like you can see the ads. They did a lot of like phone banking. They had Black students call. They had Black students write letters. And they were just doing this whole comprehensive, actual for the first time Black student recruitment. Because also the thing is, like at MIT, it has always been we don't need to recruit. We're MIT, like honestly, since the beginning. So when people were like, there's no black students here. They're like, what are we going to do? We don't recruit people. And it was like, no, like if you want to have like an equitable space, you're going to have to recruit black students. So it's kind of getting them to understand that. And then once they were able to actually practice the shared governance, and once they actually incorporated black students into the process, they had two black students sit on the admissions committee, which is like unheard of, like students deciding on students. So I think there's just so much to learn from that. I think now, especially in this environment where our black graduate student numbers have been flat, stagnant for like 10 years, like a whole mess. But I think like that's a parallel to now, right? Like 60s to now in terms of shared governance and how powerful that is. So I think the biggest takeaway is the idea of like actually using the black students on your campus who have gone through the admissions experience and know what it takes to be at this institution to help like lifting as we climb ideology.
Great, thank you.
So we've started this new initiative about how do you use your privilege. So Sharon and I have this commonality thought pattern that we as Black and Brown, we have privilege via education, via access, via financially. We have the wherewithal to speak up and use our platforms and our networks to speak on behalf of Black and Brown issues. Our new initiative is asking our allies to use their privilege and using their networks to push forward. But now my question would be to you. You know, you have this amazing platform, you have the education, you have the bandwidth. How are you going to use your privilege to help foster a healthier narrative for Black and Brown, a healthier narrative for Black and Brown women, and just a healthier narrative for all people who are being impacted by systematic racism?
Right. I think that is something I honestly struggled thinking about, specifically after George Floyd and those national conversations, kind of being elected president a couple weeks before, and kind of being the face for Black students on campus in the face of such like trauma and kind of a lot of questioning. I think like one quick answer is once I realized that Black female matriculation at MIT was actually going down the past few years, I created a program called Talented 10. So it's honestly a mentorship program. We picked 10 Black females who are currently rising seniors in high school, and we're planning to walk them through the admissions process, try to like, one, get them in, and two, convince them to come, because we have really strong competition at the other schools. So I'm excited for that. But I think like in terms of this new role and actually using, like you're saying, my platform, one of the things that I think really holds back institutions is the idea of being like boxed into like your campus. And I think like one thing Craig Wilder, who is like my MIT and slavery professor, he says is like, if you care about diversity, you wouldn't only be focusing on the diverse students on your campus, right? Especially if you have a global platform like MIT where we're doing research all over the world. So to me, my role is really convincing my institution to think outside of our campus, right? Like so many things we do affect other things, but when we talk about diversity, we're only thinking of, oh, what do the Black students at MIT need right now, right? Versus what about this racial wealth gap? What about on an economic scale? Like what can we do in terms of our contracting? Where do we bank? Like who's investing our money? Kind of really like pushing the boundaries of thinking to really explain that we are on a global stage, so we need to have a global impact. So I think those are my takeaways.
Love it.
All right, so this has been such an amazing conversation, and just hearing you speak is so inspiring. Your story, even before meeting you, has been incredibly inspiring to me, and I think that if there's more people like you out there on college campuses, in the halls of America's high schools and so on, I have really great sort of aspirations for our country's future if there are a lot of people out there doing the work that you're doing from a micro level to a macro level. If you could give our audience a couple of pieces of advice of ways that they could sort of activate themselves now to kind of convert all their resources and energy into part of the solution, what would you sort of say to them as things they could do that are actionable immediately now to create change?
Yeah, I think honestly the biggest actionable is kind of a little bit of a dodge from your question, but I do think it's really important to highlight that like you can't like be a good advocate for anyone if you're not taking care of yourself. I think a lot of people try to go to that step too soon, and the most important thing is to make sure you're good and you can like take care of yourself. I think in regards to, like I mentioned, like the George Floyd incident on like seeing the video and kind of that national conversation about race, like it would have been really easy for me to like write up a statement and send it out and kind of not be authentic because I hadn't processed my feelings yet. But I think I took like a week to just reflect, talk to my friends, figure out where I was at before I did anything. And I think that's so important. That's something like with this digital age that people don't do because everything is so quick, move there. Like, so I think it's really important to check out when you need to check out and take a break when you need to take a break. But I think that like that also relates to the idea of like the revolution will not be televised, like really understanding that although you can like read books and watch documentaries, you'll learn stuff, but you won't change unless you reflect on the prejudices in your head. So I think that really like the good idea is that like nothing will change unless everyone is able to self-reflect and figure out how they're perpetuating these systems. So I think more than ever, like, yes, encourage people to educate themselves, but most importantly, encourage people to reflect on their own biases and like how they're perpetuating these systems of oppression.
A sidebar. You know, Gil Scott meant that as an internal reflection, right? The revolution. Yeah. When I heard that, I was like, oh, I mean, it just made my heart warm that you were able to move through that space so eloquently. So I just want to say thank you for that reference point.
Yeah, favorite song.
Listen, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. Again, so excited to watch your career and your path as you move forward, and we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us at the King's Run.
Thank you so much. Deeply appreciate it.
Thanks, Danielle.